Hey, what's up everyone? This is Alex. Today I want to talk about the 5-step workflow that I follow when mixing my orchestral tracks. So as an example, we're going to use my Pirates of the Caribbean cover, which sounded something like this. And if you want to hear the whole thing, it's available on my channel. It's kind of long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing now. But today I want to talk about how I go about mixing my orchestral music, and it's much more simple than you might think it is. Now, I'm not going to go super much in depth about these subjects because every step of the process is something I discussed in tutorials I made in the past. If you missed it, I'm going to link the playlist on top right of the screen right now, where you're going to find, it's called How to Mix and Master Orchestral Music Tutorials. That's the name of the playlist. You're going to find something like 6 or 8 tutorials about mixing stuff that I'm going to mention in the later part of this video. So if you want to learn more about the things we're going to discuss today, check out that playlist and check out those tutorials because that's where I go very much in depth. In this one, I just want to outline the 5 steps, which are the following. So the first step is writing a good arrangement first. Second step usually is tweaking reverb. The third is volume balancing and panning. The fourth step is EQing. So I do either aggressive EQ or surgical EQ. And the fifth step is fine-tuning the details, with additional mixing units like compression, stereo imagers, and also comparing the mix with a reference mix. So those are the 5 steps. In a moment, we're going to see how I tackled all those 5 steps. But first, I want to say this is not the secret formula to mixing all orchestral music. This is just my personal approach that I use when mixing my tracks. But mixing is an art itself, so there's many ways in which you can do it. Depending on the arrangement you have in front of you, you might want to change them. Now, I usually follow these 5 steps, and what I do is I split my sessions, my music production sessions, into arranging, mixing, and then mastering. Although while arranging, sometimes I will add some mixing plugins here and there if I'm sure I need them. But I have my brain completely focused on one task at a time, either arranging, mixing, or mastering. All right, so let's see what these steps are and how I tackle them. So the first step is writing a good arrangement. Now, with good arrangement, I mean something that sounds balanced, clear, and where it's easy to tell, what the main elements are. An arrangement with good transitions, something that carries through without boring the listener to death. And especially that sounds balanced in terms of frequency. Again, that's the fundamental part there. Now, all of these things should be taken care of before you mix the track. So I just disable all the mixing effects, and this is how this track sounds now. It's still kind of clear, it doesn't sound as awesome, but you can still tell which are the main elements. There isn't clutter in the bass. The frequency spectrum is calibrated correctly and all those things. Ideally, your track should sound decent before you start to mix it, because some of the problems you might have in the mix, in the arrangement phase, you might not be able to solve them in the mix. So say, for example, we removed, let's remove, for example, the higher layer of percussion. And let's see how this part sounds now. It doesn't sound quite open, right? Because we don't have those high frequencies. Now, I explained this better in my, the #1 mixing rule to get your track to sound professional tutorial, and also in the layering tutorial that I made a year ago. But basically, now if we have the problem where, the percussion they don't have this, the cymbals and everything, so they don't provide the openness. One thing that comes to mind to an untrained person is to maybe just boost the high frequencies, maybe on the percussion. So let's try that. Let's see how it works out. It can work, but it's not the same degree of openness here. So, and the problem is that sometimes in your arrangements, when you boost, aggressively frequencies like this, first thing you do is you alter the nature of an instrument. So that can be, good, but it can also lead to bad results sometimes, because ideally your orchestral music should sound realistic. If your strings sound unnatural or alien, like they sound like no strings do in nature, then that's not good. So when you EQ things aggressively, you incur into those problems. And maybe you also screw up the balance of your track in terms of frequencies, right? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but this shouldn't be the path of least resistance. That should be the last resort, in my opinion. So rather than boosting frequencies like that, one thing you can do is to actually find instruments that sit around that range of frequencies that we don't have and use those, which is what Hans Zimmer did in this orchestration, which, by the way, is a Hans Zimmer orchestration. I didn't write it. I just rewrote it entirely by ear, but he composed the original thing. And in the original song, in this part, you have gongs, cymbals, and shakers that open up the track. And they sound something like this. Very subtle. I also added some trailer hits there to make it a bit more enforced. But they're very subtle, but they are, very present in the highs, more than any other sound. So when we play it together with the rest, the highs are now filled with that signal that is provided by the instruments that naturally sit in that part of the frequency range. So we get the full sound. Compared to this. So you get the idea. You also have the same problem with bass. For example, here, maybe if I were to remove the bass instruments here, it would sound something like this. And that's not very good. So you might think, well, I'm just going to do an EQ on the French horn and increase the French horn, etc. The low end of the French horn. That's not going to give you a good result. Because what the French horn are doing here is not playing in the low frequencies at all. So you kind of have to fix the arrangement. So one thing you can do is to add instruments that belong to that range. So I added bass trombone, cellos, and basses, and now you have that warmth. So, if you have problems in your spectrum has holes into it, one thing you should do is to fix your arrangement. When I mean fix arrangements, it's not only about spectrum, it's also sometimes about, articulation. Sometimes you might use the wrong articulations, maybe your strings sound weak, then you might think, well, I'm just going to add some parallel compression on the strings and make them sound bigger and thicker. Well, you can do that, or you can try to find an articulation that sounds way more, aggressive, and that's going to produce a better result. So basically, the big idea is to not delve into the, oh yeah, I'm going to fix it in the mix mentality, because that is poison for your track. It's what makes people's tracks never sound good, And I do private feedbacks, as you might know. People send me their music through my website, and I answer with a 20 minutes review of the music. And most times my clients tell me, yeah, I wrote these songs, but I hear that the mix has problems. Can you tell me what I can fix? And 99% of the time, the problem is in the arrangement and not in the mix. So if you go with the mentality of, I'm going to fix it in the mix, you're going to write music that doesn't sound good. Because you're not going to do your job of being a composer who writes great arrangements, which is 80% of this whole job, writing great arrangements. Literally. 80% of my channel is dedicated to that. All the videos on my channel mostly are dedicated to that. And I never talk about mixing, because mixing is sort of like the icing on the cake. But if the cake sucks, you can put all the icing you want. It's never going to be great, If you fix in the mix, it's like putting patches everywhere. And that is not going to look good. It's not going to sound good. So, and it's also going to be more complicated. So it's much better to learn how to arrange. Now, if you don't know where to start when learning how to arrange, because there are many things to keep in mind, of course, about instrumentation and knowing articulations and all those things. Well, what can help you is checking out the rest of the videos on this channel, because as I mentioned, I made a lot of tutorials, and many of those are about arranging and orchestration. So checking out those will help you. If my tutorials are a bit too daunting, or if you want something that is more concise, more precise, and that follows you, that sets you through a path from zero to hero, then I recommend you to check out my sponsor, Evident, and especially their course, Cinematic Music from Idea to Finished Recording, is exactly what you need. It tells you literally everything about composing modern orchestral music, and it's laid down in a way where you can start at most basic level and end up becoming an expert about this. So if you want to get the course, which I highly recommend, you can do so through the link in the description of this video. And if you get it from there, you can also give me a hand, because that's an affiliate link. So it's going to help me into keeping on running this channel, because that is what sponsors do. They enable us YouTubers to keep on running our channels for free. Now, after you nail the arrangement part, then you can start looking at other things like reverb. Well, reverb is one of the most important things to use. So you should use it straight away, because it helps into creating a sense of realism that only reverb can create. Basically, it makes your track sound as if, or rather the instruments in your track, sound as if they were being performed in front of you, in a stage in front of you, rather than being performed next to you. I should point out that there are multiple ways of using reverb, you know. You can use one reverb unit per each instrument, so you might end up using like 10 or 20 reverbs. That can be very CPU intensive. You can also use one reverb and send all the instruments to it differently, so that saves CPU. And you can do even hybrid, where you use maybe 3 different reverbs and you send some of the instruments to the first, some to the second, and some to the third. That is what's called parallel reverbs. What I do though is I use one reverb only and I send all the instruments to that in a way, and I'm going to explain you later. Now, most orchestral libraries come with an internal reverb. You know, the way they were recorded includes some of the sound of the air, you know, for each note. So you have a bit of reverb inside each note when in your orchestral libraries. But basically, if you add more, like what I do is I set my libraries to using closed mics so that I have less reverb possible in those libraries. And then I use Valhalla Room as a reverb for everything in a way that I'm going to explain now. But I explained this more in depth in my reverb tutorial. And I also explained it a bit in the mixer routing tutorial too. So I'm not going to digress too much into it. But basically, when you don't have reverb and when you have reverb, the sound is a bit different. So I'm going to show you an example. Listen to how the track sounds when I toggle it on and off. It's very subtle, but listen to it. When I enable reverb, the track sounds way more expansive. You know, it sounds bigger. You know, it's stuff like that. That's because it simulates, you know, the reflections, the echoes of all the instruments inside a virtual room, which is created by the reverb, kind of. The way I use it now, I only use one reverb and I send all the signal of all the instruments to it. The way I do this is by using, you know, mixer groups and mixer sends. So for example, you know, I have a mixer insert for each main instrument. I have one for basses, one for cello, violas, blah, blah, etc., French horn, etc. But each instrument is sent to a mixer group that contains all its brothers pretty much. So I have a group for strings, a group for brass, one for choir, one for a certain type of percussion, etc., etc. And basically the idea is that this group will allow me to process all the things together. So if I want to increase the low end of all the strings, I can just do this. It's going to affect all the strings. Or, you know. But the other way, like the other reason why I use this group here is that I can send this to the, you know, the master and the wet channel. Now, pretty much what we have here, what exits this strings track is the dry signal of the strings. If I only send this to the master without sending it to the reverb, it sounds like this. The dry signal of the strings. Now, we have this mixer track, which contains this instance of Valhalla Room, which is 100% wet, which means that whatever gets sent here, you know, to this mixer track, is also sent to this reverb, which processes it in a 100% wet way. So this is what we get out of it. So basically, one channel will have the dry signal of the strings, and the other channel we have the wet signal. Now, I can edit how much volume, like how much intense the signal is when I send it to this channel. So if I can choose to send more of the dry signal to the master directly and less of the dry signal to the reverb channel. So basically, when I trick this ratio, I determine how much of the reverb signal we're going to hear compared to the dry signal. So by increasing this, I get a hell lot of reverb. Now, this is done to simulate the, you know, how far or close an instrument is. The way I do this is actually use this controller. But I'm not going to explain it how it is set up. I explained this in the comments of my reverb tutorial. So if you use FL Studio and you want to use something similar to manage a reverb, check out the comments in that video. Now, basically the idea though is that the more reverb you add to an instrument, the more far it's going to sound. The less reverb you add, the more frontal it's going to sound. Now, when you use reverb, you don't want to use too much depth. And this is something I did before. A mistake I did. I used too much reverb depth and I used a lot of decay seconds. So it will sound, you know, super huge. so huge that the instruments sounded as if they were playing in another room. So that's not very good, you know? Ideally, you want your instrument to sound as if they're playing in front of you in a venue. You're in the sittings and in front of the stage. If you don't use reverb, it feels as if the instrument, if you don't use reverb and you use closed mics, it feels as if the instruments are being performed next to you. So like you're listening to the orchestra while sitting in the middle of the orchestra. That's not how it sounds when you go to a concert, right? You want to simulate the feel of a concert, sort of. So you need the instruments to sound a little bit more distant. So you should use reverb, but not too much, just enough to make them sound in front of you in a stage. Now, determining like the ratio I showed you before between dry and wet determines how far or close an instrument sounds, right? So what I do is maybe I want the strings to sound more powerful than the brass. One good thing I could do is to bring the string forwards and leave the brass a bit in the back. So the brass has a bit more reverb and sounds, you know, in the back and stuff like that. Now, the hierarchy that you might want your instruments to have in terms of how far or close they sound might be different depending on your orchestration. But if you want a good place to start, you might want to go on Google and search for orchestra seating or orchestra setting. You're going to find schemes, you know, graphical schemes where you're going to see how orchestras are usually laid out. And, you know, you can make the frontal instruments a bit more dry and the further instruments a bit, you know, less dry. But you also need to be careful because some instruments like percussion that have a lot of low end, if you put too much reverb on them and, you know, it's not going to sound good because the low end you know, the way reverb processes low end is not super great. So sometimes some instruments should be frontal, you know? It's just, you should just do it to taste. It should sound natural. That's the whole purpose of reverb, making things sound natural. As long as your reverb makes things sound natural, you're doing a great job. But if they sound too distant or they sound alien or they sound muddy, then you might want to tweak your reverb a little bit. Another thing you can do is to add pre and post EQs to your reverb. In here, I just reduced the low end a little bit because I want the reverb to have less rumble and stuff like that. It's usually stuff that you can even do inside the reverb, but I prefer to do it outside. So yeah, anyway, that's how I use reverb. I just have one unit, and each instrument group is being sent to, you know, the master, like dry signal of the instrument groups are being sent to the master and to the wet signal, which is then sent to the master. So we both have the dry signal and the wet signal being sent to the master in the end. So that's how I use my reverb. If you want to learn more, check out my reverb tutorial. Now, the third step, volume balancing and panning. Okay, volume balancing. Now, volume balancing is something I do in 3 ways. The reason why I do it is because maybe I want some elements to shine a bit more and other elements maybe to tone down a little bit, depending on the part of the track we're at. So for example, in this bit, you know, the 5th part and 6th part, we have 2 motives. Or motifs, still not sure how you say that word. The first motive is played by the French horn. And the second is played by the high strings, like violins and stuff like that. So as I explained in my tutorial, 2 ways to make melodies stand out in any arrangement. One cool trick you might want to use when, you know, writing melodies, if you want them to stand out, is to change the instrument in which they're playing. If you change the main instrument, the main protagonist, on each part of the structure, pretty much, on each, verse or something, that leads to your orchestration to sound more interesting and more alive. Now, the issue is that maybe an instrument may be more quiet than the other. For example, the French horn here may be too powerful compared to the first violin. So when you change that instrument, do that change of instrument, maybe the second instrument is, you know, sounds weak or something. Maybe the arrangement, the rest of the arrangement, the background in the arrangement becomes bigger when the second instrument comes on. So what you might have is a protagonist, you know, the instrument that is playing the melody, being drowned by the rest. That can be avoided with volume balancing. So basically, I'm going to explain you how I balance my volume from, you know, the macro level to the micro level, but I do it to make sure that the background instruments are in the background and the frontal instruments, the ones that I want to be the protagonist of this part of the structures, are on the front. So there are 3 ways in which I manage the volume balancing. This is something I try to, you know, keep in check while I compose, actually. But after composing the whole track, I will redo it a little bit more precisely. So what I like to do usually I don't do it all the time, but usually I will take all the mixing, like all the mixer channels and bring them down to minus infinity dB. So I bring them down to silence. And then I will play the track and bring back up all the single instruments, one by one. Try to achieve the balance that I want them to have. So that's part of the macro level. The second part of the macro level is going on each part of the structure and asking myself, which instrument group do I want to prevail in this part? Okay, maybe in the intro I want the strings to be louder, so I will go on the strings mixer group. I will open a volume controller of any sort and do an automation, which is this one, strings volume here. Then for each part I will ask myself, how loud do I want the strings to be here? And then I will increase or decrease the volume accordingly to how loud I want them to be in that part. If you do automations and you keep the volume rising and falling and stuff, depending on you don't have to do wild things, but you can even just do an automation on each structure change. That is going to give your track more character because the volumes will change. So in some parts, we will naturally hear some instruments more than others. So that's the second part of the macro level. And I do this usually for all the main instrument groups. So I did this for the strings, for the brass, for the choir, for the woodwinds, and for the percussion, etc., etc. That's the macro level. Now, another thing I might ask myself is, all right, I want the strings to be so loud in this part. Cool. But for all the strings, I ask myself, what instrument among the strings do I want to shine? So for example, in the part I showed you before, where there's the violins that are taking the lead, we have the violas and cellos doing many things, right? So I wanted the violins to really take the lead a lot. So I went and I created an automation clip. And in this part, the structure, I do a boost of volume on the violins. So this is the same concept, like the same thinking as the strings group, but I just do it on a micro level where I, tweak the volume of each single instrument. So it's the same reasoning, it just gives you more precision into it. So I like to do things this way, and this helps me into making sure that the main instrument, the protagonist of each part of the structure, is actually the most noticeable, not only in terms of frequencies, but also in terms of volume, which is just as important. Now, another way to make your instruments more noticeable or a melody more noticeable is layering, of course, but volume is important too. So that's how I balance my volumes. And I just do automations on the volume knobs here. And I like to leave the faders that I mentioned before static because they also provide me a visual feedback of how my track is balanced in terms of volume. And I might also want to change them. Maybe in the entire track, I decide that the cellos are too powerful, then I just go here and I lower this, and that's that. The automation stays as it is. It's just that the overall level is going to be brought down by a few decibels. So it gives you freedom to do whatever you want and to rebalance how you want. And I also use this volume fader on the reverb wet signal. The other reason why I use one reverb only is that it gives me freedom. Maybe I just want to reduce the reverb from all the instruments together. If I have a send with only one reverb unit, then I can just decrease the volume of the send, and it's going to decrease the volume of the reverb. Or if I want to add more reverb, I'm just going to increase the volume of the send. Same thing. Well, if I had a reverb on every single instrument and I wanted to reduce the overall amount of reverb, I will have to go on every single instrument and reduce the volume on every single instrument 10 times. And that's not very smart for me. So that's how I use, the volume balancing. More info about that on the mixing routing tutorial, I think. Now, panning. As for panning, this is something I learned just while composing this track. I sent it to a friend of mine, Andrzej Rozman. I hope that's the right way to say his name. He's an insane composer, really great composer. And I sent him this track and he was like, why is everything sounding so weird? Did you pan your instruments? And I'm like, yeah, I normally pan my instruments. And he told me that's a mistake because, as I mentioned before, each orchestral instrument has a bit of reverb into it because it was recorded in a room. And the way these libraries are recorded, especially like professional libraries like Metropolis and stuff like that, is that they are already pre-panned. So if you apply additional panning, you're going to just destabilize the balance. And also, you are also going to pan the internal reverb that is contained inside the library. So it's not as if you're panning the instrument, it's as if you're panning entire rooms. So that creates a weirdness and doesn't sound much realistic if you pan orchestral libraries. That's what my friend Andrzej told me. And I was like, what? I pan for all my life. Like I always pan orchestral instruments. I thought that was the way. And maybe I mentioned this in previous tutorials as well, so that was a mistake. I tried to remove the panning from all the orchestral instruments, and it really gave a great result. So if you're using professional libraries, you might not want to pan. For percussion, I still did panning because in that case, you can. And I also use panning on other libraries that were not recorded in a super professional way and sounded centric. So if your libraries are pre-panned, don't use panning. If your libraries are not pre-panned, then use panning. But yeah, that's what my friend told me. I tried it and it had a great impact. So try it on your songs and see how it works out. So that's it for volume balancing and panning. Now let's talk about EQing, which is not much different from volume balancing, by the way. Okay, so EQing, this is like the fourth step in my workflow. Sometimes it's the last, depends on the arrangement. But basically, this is something that if you want to understand how EQing works, you need to have an understanding of how the spectrum of frequencies work and what each band of frequencies represent. This is something I talked about at length in my tutorial about equalizers and spectrum, how to mix orchestral music, which I'm going to link in the top right of the video on the cards. Now, I'm not going to go as much in depth in this video because that is like 30 minutes long. But basically, an EQ is just a tool that is going to allow you to do an even more precise volume balancing. Because what you do here with the EQ, when you increase the bands, etc., is you increase the volume of a certain subset of frequencies in your instrument. This can lead to alter the nature of your sound because depending on the instrument, certain frequencies will hold most of the characteristics of that instrument. So for example, for the percussion, very simple example, as I showed you before, the high end determines how sharp they sound. Because high end contains pretty much the signal of the sticks, the sharp edge of the sticks. Instead, this range from around 70 to 90 contains the sub, like the very boomish quality of the percussion. So there are two ways of EQing in my mind. I call them aggressive EQ and surgical EQ. Now, aggressive EQ is when you do like very broad EQing, impacting a wide range of frequencies. When you do that, you tend to alter the sound of, whatever you're altering, You have to do that being aware of what you're doing. So for example, a good example of aggressive EQing, by the way, is probably the Cora in this track. So in this track, I think here, somewhere. Yeah. So in this part, we have this. I EQ'd this like this because I wanted to shape it differently, sculpt it differently. The original sound is this. So with this EQing, it sounds a bit, more thin because it has way less low end. It sounds a bit more high and stuff like that. So this is something that you can come up with just by messing around or by having an understanding of frequency, the frequencies of an instrument. But basically, a good thing about EQs is that sometimes they show you even like visual feedback, so you can understand what's going on. Anyway, this is aggressive EQing. Surgical EQ is what I use not to shape the nature of a sound, but to actually fix something. For example, overlaps. Now, overlaps, to explain that, I should go a bit in depth. Pretty much, when you have a sound, for example, the violins here. So, when you have, for example, these violins, a single note will create multiple harmonics. It has a fundamental and some harmonics that repeat throughout the spectrum. This is what a tone looks like in terms of spectrum. Now, two different notes, say C and G, might have common harmonics because that's just how they are, and that's why they create a major chord. I'm not going to go in depth about that, but pretty much know that each note has one fundamental, which is like the loudest frequency, and then many harmonics, which are, like the childs of the frequency, if you will. It's not exactly like this, but stupid example. Now, if you play the same note on different instruments, you might have an overlap of common harmonics. So what you might end up having is some frequencies stand out too much, maybe in certain parts of the song, because in that part there is maybe a C5, which is being played by too many instruments at the same time. Or maybe there is a C5 and some G notes that when played together create a huge overlap. And when huge overlaps happen, you get something sort of like a not so pleasant sound. So as an example, let's see if I can show you what I mean. You hear that? That sort of unpleasant high sound. That happens when you have an overlap in your orchestration sometimes. So if that happens and you feel that sort of sharpness, you see that peak, strange peak somewhere in your frequencies, in your track, what you can do is apply surgical EQ. With surgical EQ, I mean stuff like this. So what I do, like what I did here, I think it was in this part that it happened. In the strings, I have that overlap, and I didn't really like it, you know. So what I did is I went here on span. I detected it by pressing Control left click. This allows you to detect frequencies like this. And when I found where that strange overlap was in the frequencies, I went in my EQ. I went in the exact frequency. I adjusted this to be a bit more precise and brought it down quite a lot. You know, this was like, you know, -6 decibels. So on that single harmonic, I reduced the volume to -6 decibels, and I did the same thing on other harmonics too. Because all throughout the track, sometimes I had overlaps in the violins and on those harmonics, and it was too much. So I just applied this surgical EQ to fix that problem. So you can use EQ in a broad way, but a gentle. That's what I would call aggressive. Or you can even not gentle, but when you are not gentle, you change the nature of a sound. Or you can use it in a surgical way, but just remove the tiny little detail that is creating a weird overlap. And yeah, this can be very useful. And you can do it on a macro, or micro. I prefer to do it on micro because sometimes it's just a single instrument that has that problem. If I were to do this on the strings, and it would affect the entire string sounds, and maybe I wouldn't have to do it, like maybe I don't need to cut that frequency on cellos, so why should I apply it here? I would rather go on the particular instrument that has that problem and fix it there. Now, I also apply surgical EQ on my master sometimes, reducing some, maybe here it was maybe a general overlap and I didn't want to go and find the instrument because maybe I was tired and just did this and that was it. And then I boosted the highs just a little, you know, it's like 1 decibel boost because I wanted the track to sound a bit more bright. And you're going to understand what I mean by bright or dark if you check out the tutorial about, you know, spectrum and EQs, which I do recommend you check out. So that's how I use EQs, aggressive or surgical, very simple. It's just a way to make sure that everything sounds like I want it to. And again, each instrument has different features, so the high end of the percussion is going to serve a different purpose from the high end of the strings of a guitar, for example. But, you know, the low end and the mid range and the high end of every instrument sort of have the same flavor. So the high end is like open and sharp, and the low end is like deep and warm and stuff like that. If you want to learn more though, I just recommend you to watch the tutorial. Now let's move to the 5th and final step. So the 5th step and final step is fine tuning. This track is probably not the best example to show that because I almost did nothing of that sort here. But with fine tuning, I mean adding stuff like, you know, parallel compression, compressors, delay, you know, just to even give more character to a sound. Maybe a good example would be the harpsichord here, although, well, let's hear what it sounds with the fine tuning on. This is with the fine tuning, this is without. So now the problem of this harpsichord is that it wasn't as, you know, expansive as I wanted to. So other than EQing it aggressively, I also added a sound goodizer, which is like a parallel compressor, which if you put it on your songs, in your instruments, it might give them more bite, you know, and it changes the nature of it a little bit. I added this one because it was too quiet for my taste, and I didn't have other harpsichord libraries, so in this case I had to post-process this a little bit. The second thing I did is add a bit of delay to it. It's not too too loud, but it's just enough to give that sort of echo, and which makes it a bit more spacious. I just added this detail, but in your tracks, when you hear an element that is not like you want it to, maybe if it's not as big as wide as you want it to, then you can add some delay to it. Ping pong delay does the trick. Another thing that helps is adding stereo imagers or changing their stereo separation, which is what I did here on the harpsichord to make them a bit more open. Another thing you can do is add compression. And I talked about compression. I made 2 tutorials, one about normal compression and one about sidechain compression. Both are very interesting ways of, like managing a volume, reducing the dynamic range of a sound. So all those things, all those finishing touches, I would leave them for the last, to make sure that every instrument sounds exactly as I want it to. But again, I prefer to fix problems in the arrangement first and revert to mixing, techniques only if I have no choice, or only if mixing makes it, like fixing the problem with mixing is actually easier and faster. But basically, all these things are advanced things you might want to do just as a slight detail. Another fine tuning you can do is maybe on some low instruments, maybe like tubas, bass trombones, basses, add a bit of distortion to amplify their frequency, amplify the harmonics. Just a little bit, not too much though. That helps. And, all those additional techniques, you discover them as time goes. But those are very subjective to the arrangement, and they're like tricks you can learn. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, though, I highly recommend you to check out the Avinan course, because if I haven't mentioned it, that course also has information about mixing and also about mastering, which is something I haven't talked yet on this channel. I will in the future, mastering with Isotope Ozone, which is a great plugin. The final step of the 5th, step is comparing the track with a reference mix. So what I do is I usually import a reference mix, like a track from someone else that has the shape, the sound that I want to, and the loudness that I want to have with the track I'm working on. I import the track in my project, and then I, solo my track and that reference mix as they play, so I can compare how one stands against the other. And if they don't sound alike, then I will first thing check the frequency spectrum of my reference mix, see how it looks like, then check the frequency spectrum of my track and see if there are major differences. If they are, then I will go in the arrangement to try to fix the holes and the differences that we have in the frequency spectrum. Then if the frequency spectrum is the same, then maybe the problem is the volume. In that case, I will work on the mastering to make sure that the volumes match. And when I'm close enough to my reference mix, in terms of sound, in terms of how it looks, in terms of how loud it is, then I will be glad and save and export the master, and that will be it. So that's pretty much my process. I will talk about mastering in another video, but yeah, anyway, this is all for my mixing workflow. I hope this helped. And if you have questions, let me know in the comments of the video. And again, if you want to support my channel and support your growth as a composer, consider getting the course from the description of my video, or you can even just send me one of your tracks for feedback on my website, alexmunkala.com. I will review it for you, giving lots of advices on what needs to be improved. So those are 2 great ways in which you can invest in yourself and help me on keeping on running this channel. So thank you for watching this video all the way through. Let me know what you thought about it and share it with some friends who might earn some value out of it. So yeah, that's all for today. I'll see you next time.